It's strange how the sharpest turns in life can hide inside an ordinary day. One moment you're surrounded by familiar faces, the hum of small talk, the clink of glasses, and the next, you're standing in the middle of something you can't quite name yet, but you can feel it pressing in, cold and certain. I didn't know it at the time, but every smile in that room had an edge. Every casual remark was laying a brick in a wall I'd soon finish myself. This isn't just a story about a choice. It's about the quiet before that choice, the way it builds until you can't ignore it anymore. Stay with me, because when the truth arrives, it will land where it hurts most. Like this video, subscribe for the rest, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from so I know who's walking into this with me. I have been to more family gatherings than I can count, and for most of my life, my place at the table was never in question. I was the one who built the foundation of this family in more ways than one, the man who carved the turkey every Thanksgiving, poured the wine at Christmas, and made sure no one left my home without a full stomach and a warm coat in winter. But this year, as my 65th birthday approached, I could feel something was off, even before the day came. It started the night before when my phone buzzed and I saw a short text from my daughter Melissa. We had spoken earlier in the week, and she'd said she was putting together a little something for me. But her tone had been lukewarm, like she was fulfilling an obligation rather than extending an invitation. Now, the message read, "Can you bring your own chair? We don't have enough." I stared at those words, waiting for the punchline, but none came. I have a house full of furniture, yet the request didn't feel like it was about practicality. It felt like it was about putting me in my place. I typed sure and hit send, but the unease in my chest stayed with me all night. The next afternoon, I dressed carefully in my best pressed shirt and dark slacks, polished my shoes until they shone, and combed back my thinning silver hair. I wanted to walk in looking like the man I've always been, proud, respectable, and still standing tall despite the years. The driveway was packed with cars, so I parked down the street and walked up, carrying the folding chair under my arm like some kind of badge of humiliation. Greg, my son-in-law, opened the door. His eyes flicked to the chair, and his lips curled into a smirk. "Good, you brought it," he said, stepping aside without so much as a happy birthday or a handshake. Inside, the house was filled with voices and laughter. I could hear Melissa in the kitchen chatting with a group of her friends from the neighborhood, Greg's coworkers sitting around the table, and my grandkids on the floor with their tablets. Melissa came over, brushed her cheek lightly against mine, and gestured vaguely toward the dining area. My seat, if you could call it that, was the only folding chair in the house, placed between the hallway to the kitchen and the trash can. Everyone else had cushioned dining chairs arranged neatly around the table, close enough to be part of the conversation. My spot was an afterthought, wedged in a space that smelled faintly of garbage from the half-open lid beside me. I set the chair down and sat with my back straight, pretending not to notice the obvious separation. Melissa was too busy arranging plates and laughing with her friends to even glance my way again. The feeling of exclusion settled over me heavier than the chair itself. I told myself maybe the table was too crowded. Maybe this was convenience, but deep down I knew better. The conversations flowed easily among them, stories and jokes bouncing back and forth while I sat on the edge of the circle. At one point, a woman I didn't know leaned over from the table and asked, "So, Harold, how's retired life treating you?" Before I could answer, Greg shouted from across the room, "Oh, he's got nothing but time these days." Laughter erupted like it was the cleverest line of the night. I smiled faintly and sipped my coffee, which I placed on the floor beside my chair because there was no table space for me. The bitter taste mixed with the sharper bitterness in my chest, and I began to wonder how long I could stand to stay. But I kept my posture straight and my expression neutral because I've learned that dignity sometimes means swallowing the hurt until the right moment to act arrives. Over the next hour, The little cuts kept coming. Melissa's friend made a comment about how lucky I was not to have to keep up with the fast pace of work anymore. Greg joked that I should rent out my garage now that I wasn't using my tools. My grandkids barely looked up from their screens when I tried to speak to them, mumbling one-word answers before going back to their games. I hung my coat on the rack by the door, but before my hand even left the sleeve, Greg's voice cut through the chatter, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "Hey, Harold," he called. "You remember to bring cash for gas money this time?" His tone was wrapped in a lazy grin, but his eyes carried something sharper. A few people chuckled under their breath, and I felt the heat rise in my face. Last year, they had picked me up because my truck was in the shop, and the idea that I should owe them for it, especially on my own birthday, was insulting. I managed a thin smile and replied, "Didn't realize it was a fair meter last time," but the humor in my voice was hollow. Greg turned back to his beer without responding, clearly satisfied he'd made his point. I moved toward the dining table, where a small cake sat in the center. At first glance, it looked like any ordinary store-bought cake, until I saw the faint remnants of a previous message beneath the white icing. In slightly uneven handwriting, "Happy Retirement" had been scraped out and replaced with "Good luck," the letters mismatched in color and size, as if they'd run out of proper icing tubes. The message felt careless, almost mocking. It wasn't a cake chosen for me. It was whatever had been on clearance, patched over to look personal. Melissa was in the kitchen pouring drinks, and when she caught me looking at the cake, she smirked. "It's the thought that counts, right?" she said, not bothering to hide the sarcasm. I nodded slowly, even though it was becoming harder to keep my composure. I had built my life on giving my best effort to every job, every gift, every gesture, and here was my family presenting me with something that looked like it had been an afterthought grabbed on the way home from work. People began gathering around the table for what I assumed was going to be a casual cake cutting, but even in that small circle, I was left standing slightly apart. The good seats were already taken by Melissa's friends, and Greg leaned casually against the table, his back partially blocking me from stepping closer. When Melissa brought out the candles, she lit them one by one while chatting with her friend Jessica about a neighborhood event, barely glancing at me. When it came time to sing, the voices were uneven, some trailing off halfway through, as if even that small gesture required too much effort. I blew out the candles quickly, my wish already set firmly in my mind, though it had nothing to do with luck or health. As Melissa began slicing the cake, Greg grabbed the first piece and handed it to Jessica. The second piece went to Melissa, then to their kids, then to a couple of Greg's coworkers. My slice came last, a thin, uneven wedge with one side of icing already smudged. I took it without a word, eating slowly while watching the group around me laugh and talk about weekend plans that didn't involve me. Every bite felt like chewing through sawdust, and the bitter taste of the coffee I'd poured earlier lingered in my mouth. My presence was more ceremonial than meaningful, a box they could check to say they'd celebrated my birthday, even if the celebration was little more than a performance for appearances. I caught snippets of conversation drifting over the table. Jessica asked Melissa what she was going to do for her upcoming anniversary, and Melissa replied, "Something small. We learned from Dad's birthday that you don't need to go all out." My chest tightened at the casual cruelty of the remark, though no one seemed to think it was cruel at all. They laughed, nodded, and moved on to the next topic without missing a beat. It was clear that whatever version of me they remembered, the man who provided, who hosted, who gave without asking, had been replaced by an image of someone unnecessary, someone whose role was fading. I sat there holding the paper plate with the last forkful of cake, thinking about the years I'd spent making sure Melissa never went without. The braces she needed in high school, the college tuition payments I covered when her scholarship fell short, the down payment I helped her with when she and Greg bought their first house. All of it had been done without expectation of repayment. Not because I wanted to be owed, but because that's what family was supposed to mean. Now, here I was being treated as a punchline and an afterthought, all under the guise of celebrating me. My eyes drifted again to the cake, to the awkwardly rewritten message, and something inside me shifted. The edges of the humiliation began hardening into resolve. "Hey, Dad, show them your hands," she said loudly, her voice cutting across the low hum of conversation. I didn't move, unsure where she was going with this, but she reached forward and lifted my right hand by the wrist, holding it up for everyone to see. "See? Earthquake grip," she announced with a grin, the words rolling out like she'd rehearsed them. My knuckles were swollen and my fingers trembled slightly, something I'd learned to manage over the years since arthritis had set in. It was the kind of thing you might mention quietly in a moment of concern, but here it was laid out in the open for mockery, like a party trick for their entertainment. A few people laughed. Greg shook his head in mock sympathy. "Careful with that coffee mug, Harold," he added. "You might end up redecorating the carpet." My jaw tightened, but I didn't respond. These hands had built houses from the ground up, had framed roofs in the rain, had held Melissa steady when she was learning to ride a bike, had signed the checks that kept a roof over her head when she was struggling. Now, they were a punchline. Melissa finally released my hand and went back to sipping her wine, the moment already fading for her, but not for me. The sting of it settled into my chest. Another small but sharp confirmation that this night wasn't about honoring me. It was about reducing me. I thought I'd have a moment to recover, but Greg was already standing by the bookshelf, flipping through a photo album I'd given Melissa years ago when she moved into this house. "Hey, look at this," he called out, pulling out one of the old 8x10s from the plastic sleeve. It was a picture from the late 80s, back when I was in my prime, broad-shouldered, strong, wearing my tool belt like a badge of honor, a smear of sawdust across my cheek. Greg held it up so everyone could see, then tilted his head and squinted at the image. "Man, look at that hairline," he said, running a hand over his own head in an exaggerated motion. "Guess it started running for the hills early." The table erupted in laughter, and he waited just long enough for the noise to die down before adding, "Bet you could have used a hard hat just to keep the glare off." Another round of laughter. He passed the photo to Jessica, who looked at it and chuckled, then handed it along to Melissa. She didn't defend me or tell him to cut it out. She smirked, shaking her head as though she agreed. I stayed silent, though my pulse was pounding in my ears. That photo wasn't just an image. It was a record of the man I'd been, the years I'd spent working sunup to sundown, the strength and pride that had built the very stability they now enjoyed. Watching it become a prop for their amusement felt like a theft. As the photo made its way around the table, I could see the glances, the small smiles, the raised eyebrows. No one seemed to think about what it meant to mock a man in his own daughter's home on his own birthday. No one noticed the way I straightened in my folding chair, the way my grip tightened on the edge of the paper plate until it bent under my fingers. Melissa handed the photo back to Greg, who slid it into the album without ceremony and placed it on the edge of the bookshelf like it was something disposable. I knew in that moment that this night had already carved itself into my memory, not as a celebration, but as a turning point. They were stripping away parts of me piece by piece, laughing while they did it, and expecting me to sit quietly and accept it. That wasn't going to happen, not forever. I reminded myself that the best responses aren't given in the heat of the moment. They're crafted with patience, precision, and timing. If I spoke up now, I'd be brushed off as too sensitive or in a mood, and they'd all go back to their conversations, forgetting the moment by dessert. But if I waited, if I made my move in my own time, it would be something they'd remember for the rest of their lives. "Okay, everybody," she said, "let's play a little game." We're going to go around the table and say what we think Dad is most likely to do next in life. At first, I thought maybe she meant vacations or hobbies, something wholesome. But as soon as the first guest, a neighbor named Carl, said, probably start talking to his plants because they listen better than people, and the table erupted in laughter, I realized this was no friendly game. It was an open invitation to poke fun at me. Jessica said I'd probably become mayor of the hardware store since I spent so much time there. Greg leaned forward, pretending to be deep in thought, and then Melissa took her turn. She tilted her head, pretending to consider it seriously, before grinning wide and declaring, I think Dad's most likely to outlive his usefulness. The words hit me like a slap. There was a sharp intake of breath from someone at the far end of the table, but it was drowned out by the laughter that rolled through the room. Greg added, I guess that means he's already halfway there. We've got another round of chuckles. I kept my face still, my hands folded tightly in my lap, but the insult sank deep. Outlive his usefulness. It wasn't just a joke. It was a declaration of how she saw me now. Not as a father, not as a man who had spent decades building a life for her, but as a worn-out tool taking up space. As the game continued, more little jabs followed. Someone said I'd probably start hoarding old junk because that's what retired guys do. Another suggested I'd finally learn to knit, since those shaky hands need practice. By the time the game ended, I felt like I had been picked clean, stripped down to a caricature. I told myself to breathe, to remember that responding here, in front of these people, would only give them more to laugh about. I thought maybe the moment was over, but Greg wasn't finished. He leaned back in his chair, smirking, and said, Hey, Harold, if you ever want, I can help manage your finances. You know, numbers get harder at your age. His tone was light, as if he was offering a genuine favor, but his eyes gave him away. This wasn't help. It was condescension wrapped in fake concern. The implication was clear. I wasn't capable anymore. I forced a small smile, the kind that doesn't reach your eyes, and said, Thanks, Greg, but I think I'll manage. He laughed like he'd won some kind of point. Melissa joined in, patting my arm as though I were a child who didn't understand what was good for him. Inside, my resolve hardened even more. Every comment, every smirk, every moment like this was fuel. They were giving me all the justification I needed, and they didn't even realize it. They thought they were being clever, that their digs were harmless family banter, but what they were doing was chiseling away at the last of my patience. I sat back and let the conversation flow without me, watching the way they leaned toward each other, the way Melissa laughed at Greg's jokes like he was the sharpest man in the room. None of them noticed that I wasn't laughing anymore, that my eyes had gone distant. I was thinking about the lawyer's card in my desk drawer, the one I'd kept all these years just in case. I was thinking about the will tucked in the safe, still with their names on it. I imagined crossing those names out one by one and replacing them with someone else's, anyone else's. I thought about the charities I'd supported quietly over the years, the scholarship fund I'd once dreamed of creating for kids who didn't have the same opportunities one did. I thought about how much sweeter it would be to put my life's work into the hands of people who might actually value it. Greg was telling some story now about one of his co-workers, something about a bet they'd made, and Melissa was laughing so hard she had to wipe her eyes. My eyes wandered toward the living room wall, the same wall I'd helped Melissa decorate years ago when she and Greg first bought the house. I remembered standing on a ladder, hammering in picture hooks while she arranged the frames, insisting on symmetry and balance. Back then, the wall had been a timeline of our family. Wedding photos, baby pictures, Christmas mornings, even a shot of me holding Melissa when she was no more than 2 years old, her tiny hands clutching my shirt. But now, as I studied the wall, I realized something was wrong. My image was gone from most of it. Frames that once held pictures of me with the family now displayed Melissa and Greg on vacations, the kids at sports events, their dog wearing a birthday hat. A few of the older frames have been shifted to the bottom shelf of the nearby bookcase, so low you'd have to crouch to see them. The only photo of me still on the wall was a blurry shot from a barbecue years ago, half my face cut off at the edge. I rose slowly, using the movement as an excuse to stretch my legs, and walked toward the wall as if admiring the layout. Up close, the absence felt even more deliberate. Each frame had been carefully selected, positioned, and dusted, except the few with me, which had smudged glass and sat at awkward angles, like they'd been moved in a hurry. I traced a finger over one of the dusty frames on the shelf, the photo inside showing me in my work overalls, standing in front of the house I built with my own hands. That house had been Melissa's home for the first 10 years of her life, and now she treated the memory of it like clutter to be hidden away. Greg appeared behind me, balancing a plate of nachos, and glanced at the shelf. "Yeah, we've been meaning to update those," he said casually, already turning toward the couch. Update. That was the word. Not add to, not make room for more. Update as in replace, as in erase. The weight of it settled in my chest, heavier than the comments, heavier than the jokes. This wasn't just about mocking me. This was about rewriting the story, so I was no longer in it. Melissa returned from the kitchen, carrying a tray of drinks. She noticed me looking at the wall and grinned like she'd caught me snooping. "Don't worry, Dad," she said. "We'll get you back up there. Maybe we could do a nice black and white portrait or something." I tried to smile, but it didn't reach my eyes. "How about we just take a group picture tonight?" I suggested, all of us together. It was a simple request, the kind you'd expect on a birthday. For a moment, I thought she might agree. Instead, she rolled her eyes slightly and said, "We'll just Photoshop you in if we need to." The room wasn't even that loud, but somehow her voice carried over the low conversation and clinking glasses. A couple people chuckled. My throat tightened, and I swallowed hard to keep my voice steady. "Not the same thing," I said quietly, but Melissa was already moving toward the couch, handing Greg a drink. I stayed where I was, my back to the wall of photos, the faces of my family staring out from frames that no longer included me. In that instant, the room seemed smaller, the air heavier. I thought about how quickly people can rewrite history when it suits them, how easily they can edit you out of the frame without even pausing to consider what they're erasing. Guests shuffled in closer, some standing, some sitting, all of them curious. She handed me the envelope with a little flourish, like it contained something precious. For half a second, I let myself imagine it might be a thoughtful card or maybe tickets to something meaningful, but the moment I opened it, I knew better. Inside were 3 glossy brochures, each with a cheerful stock photo of smiling seniors on the cover and bold titles like "Your Next Chapter in Comfort Living" and "Affordable Assisted Care Options." My chest tightened, and I felt every pair of eyes in the room waiting for my reaction. Melissa leaned forward, tapping one of the brochures with her manicured finger. "We thought we'd help you get a head start, just in case. It's good to be prepared." Her tone was sweet on the surface, but underneath, it was the same razor edge that had been cutting into me all evening. A few people chuckled awkwardly. Greg took one of the brochures from the envelope and flipped through it like he was genuinely evaluating the amenities. "Ooh, look, Harold, they have a rec room. Maybe you could lead a bingo night," he said, grinning. Then, as if that wasn't enough, he glanced around at the group and added, "Guess we can start the countdown clock for when that house of his changes hands." That line got more laughs, and I felt my stomach twist. They weren't just hinting at the idea of me leaving my home. They were talking about it like it was an inevitability they were already planning for. I took the brochures back from Greg and slid them neatly into the envelope, forcing my hands to remain steady. "Thanks for thinking of me," I said, my voice calm and measured, though inside I was locking this moment into memory adding it to the growing list of reasons why the plans I'd been forming in my head were no longer just an idea. They were a certainty. Melissa seemed pleased with herself, like she had pulled off some harmless prank, but I could see in her eyes that she knew exactly what she was doing. She wanted everyone to see me as someone whose best days are behind him, someone who needed to be managed, placed, and eventually moved aside. The image of the photo wall flashed in my mind again. All those pictures of me taken down or hidden away, and now here she was trying to script the next chapter of my life for me, complete with a new address I never asked for. I looked around the room, taking in the smirks, the sideways glances, the people who didn't laugh but also didn't speak up. They were witnesses, silent but complicit. I realized then that none of them would ever defend me here. Not in this house where Melissa and Greg set the tone. This was their stage, their audience, and I was just a prop they dragged out for a birthday performance. I set the envelope on the table beside my chair, its weight somehow heavier than it should have been, and focused on keeping my breathing steady. My mind drifted just for a moment to the file cabinet in my home office, the drawer where I kept important documents. My will was in there, along with the deed to my house, the insurance policies, and the notes I'd once made about a scholarship fund. I thought about how easy it would be to make a few changes that would ensure Melissa and Greg never saw a penny from me, changes that would redirect everything I'd built towards something worthwhile, something that would actually matter. Greg was still flipping through one of the brochures, making little comments under his breath about the meal plans and the laundry service, milking the moment for every laugh he could get. Melissa laughed along, clearly enjoying the show. I sat there, letting them think they'd won, that they'd succeeded in making me the butt of the joke. But what they didn't know was that this was the moment I decided there would be no going back. The earlier insults had hurt, the erasure from the photo wall had stung, but this public display of planning my removal from my own life was the breaking point. I knew then that the gift I would give them in return would not be wrapped in paper or handed over at a party. It would come later, quietly, in the form of a lawyer reading my will to a room full of shocked faces. It would be the kind of gift that couldn't be returned or undone, the kind that would make them realize too late that every smirk, every laugh, every careless comment had a cost. Their laughter still echoed in my head long after the sound in the room had faded. I stayed seated, watching the mill about, nibbling snacks, refilling drinks, moving in and out of conversations that didn't include me. If they noticed my silence, they didn't show it. They were too busy enjoying the performance they'd orchestrated, patting themselves on the back for what they probably thought was just a little family humor. But I wasn't thinking about jokes anymore. I was thinking about closure, real, final closure, and about how it should be delivered. Around 8:30, I stood up, folded my chair, and told Melissa I was heading home. She feigned surprise, as though she hadn't already decided my departure was irrelevant. "Oh, already?" she said, glancing at her watch. "Well, drive safe, Dad." No hug, no insistence that I stay. Greg gave me a mock salute from the couch without looking up from his phone. I carried my chair out the front door, feeling the cool night air hit my face, the quiet outside wrapping around me like a balm after the noise inside. The walk to my truck felt longer than it should have, each step pulling me further away from the stale warmth of their living room and closer to the resolve hardening in my chest. When I turned the key and the engine rumbled to life, I didn't feel the usual reluctance to leave a family gathering. Instead, I felt relief and a strange kind of clarity, the kind that only comes when you finally stop pretending something is what it isn't. The drive home was a short one, but my mind filled every minute with images of what I was about to do. I thought about the file cabinet in my office, the safe tucked into the corner, the documents I kept neatly organized for years. I thought about the will inside it, still bearing the names of the people I had just left behind, people who had spent the evening reminding me exactly how little I mattered to them anymore. When I pulled into my driveway, the porch light flickered on automatically, casting a pale yellow glow over the front steps I'd built myself 30 years ago. The house looked the same as it always had, solid, dependable mind. Inside, the familiar creak of the floorboards under my feet felt almost comforting. I hung my coat on the rack, set my keys on the counter, and walked straight to the office without turning on any lights. The safe sat in its usual spot, heavy and unyielding. I spun the combination, the sound of the tumblers clicking into place loud in the stillness. Inside, the will rested on top of a neatly stacked pile of folders. I pulled it out, the weight of the paper heavier than it should have been, and carried it to my desk. The desk lamp's warm light spilled over the surface, catching on the edges of the document. I stared at it for a long moment, my hands resting on either side. This was the blueprint for everything I had built, everything I intended to leave behind. And right now, it was wrong, dangerously wrong, because it still rewarded people who had spent the night making sure I knew exactly where I stood in their lives. I opened the drawer where I kept my pens and pulled out a red marker. The cap clicked off with a sharp sound that seemed to echo in the room. I leaned over the will and, in steady, deliberate strokes, wrote across the cover, "Read after you remember who I was." The red letters stood out against the pale paper, a warning and a promise all in one. I sat back, letting the sight of it sink in, feeling a strange calm settle over me. This wasn't just about anger anymore. It was about reclaiming the narrative, about making sure the people who thought they could erase me understood that I had been here, that I had mattered, that the decisions I made were mine to make until my last breath. I placed the will back in the safe, but left the marker on the desk, a small reminder of the line I had just crossed in my mind. From this point on, I wasn't just imagining changes, I was committed to them. The rest of the night unfolded in silence. I made myself a cup of tea, sat by the window, and watched the streetlights flicker on. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked and a car door slammed, but here in my house, it was quiet enough for me to hear the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. I thought about Melissa and Greg, about their smug faces as they handed me those brochures, about the way Melissa had brushed off my request for a family photo, about the laughter when Greg joked about my house passing to them. I replayed every detail until I knew it by heart. They wouldn't see it coming. That was the beauty of it. Tomorrow, they would go about their lives, still believing they were in line to inherit everything I had worked for. They would keep laughing at the jokes, keep telling the stories, keep moving my photos lower on the shelf. There was no hesitation now, no wavering between anger and nostalgia. I had crossed the point of no return, and the only thing left to do was set the plan in motion. The sky outside was pale with the first light of dawn, and the air had that cool sharpness that comes before the day warms up. I brewed coffee without rushing, the familiar smell filling the kitchen as I went over the steps in my head. The lawyer's office wouldn't open until 9, but I wanted to be ready the moment it did. After breakfast, I dressed in my best navy suit, the one I'd worn for Melissa's wedding, the same suit I had once imagined wearing to future family events that now would never come. I polished my shoes until I could see my reflection in them, not out of vanity, but because I wanted to walk into that office looking every bit the man who had built his life from the ground up and knew exactly how to finish it on his terms. When I arrived at the lawyer's office, the receptionist looked up from her desk and greeted me with polite surprise. "Good morning, Mr. Bennett. We weren't expecting you today," she said. "I'd like to see Mr. Carver," I replied, my tone steady. She offered me coffee, which I declined, and within minutes I was sitting in the same leather chair where I'd signed the original will years ago. "Mr. Carver," a man in his late 50s with salt and pepper hair and the calm demeanor of someone who had seen more family disputes than he could count, adjusted his glasses and asked, "What brings you in today, Harold?" I placed the will on his desk, the words in red ink facing up. "I need to make changes," I said simply. He read the line I'd written and gave a small nod, not asking for explanations I wasn't ready to give. I outlined the new terms. Every asset I own, from my house to my savings to my life insurance payout, would be placed into a trust. The beneficiaries would be children of widowed single mothers, selected through a scholarship program I dreamed about starting but had always put off. It was time to stop putting it off. Mr. Carver listened without interruption, jotting notes as I spoke. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied me for a moment. "You're certain?" he asked. "Once this is finalized, there's no going back." I met his gaze without flinching. "I'm certain. They've made it clear who I am to them. This is me making it clear who they are to me." He didn't push further. Instead, he slid a stack of documents toward me, explaining each section as I signed. My signature flowed smoothly, no hesitation in the pen strokes. With each page, I felt a weight lifting, replaced by a quiet satisfaction. This wasn't revenge. Not exactly. It was correction. The trust would outlast me, helping people who genuinely needed it, and Melissa and Greg would never again mistake my silence for weakness. When the paperwork was nearly done, I leaned forward and added one final instruction. The day after my funeral, I told him I want an envelope delivered to my daughter and her husband. Inside, there should be a single line: "Your inheritance was given to someone who needed it." Nothing more, nothing less. Mr. Carver's brow lifted slightly, but he wrote it down. "You want me to include your name?" he asked. "No," I said, my voice firm. "They'll know." We went over the logistics, the trust structure, the selection process for beneficiaries, the legal protections to prevent interference. I left nothing to chance. By the time I set the pen down for the last time, every detail had been secured, every loophole closed. I glanced at the clock on the wall. Barely 2 hours had passed since I walked in, yet it felt like I had drawn a new boundary around the rest of my life. As I stood, Mr. Carver extended his hand. "I'll make sure it's done exactly as you've outlined," he said. I shook his hand firmly, feeling the grip of a man who understood the weight of final decisions. Outside, the sunlight had grown brighter, the city humming with midday activity. I walked to my truck with an ease I hadn't felt in years, not because the past had been erased, but because the future had been rewritten in my own words. On the drive home, I passed a small park where children were playing, their laughter carrying across the street. I thought about the kids who would benefit from the trust, about the doors that might open for them because of a man they'd never meet. That thought settled deeper than any bitterness, though the bitterness was still there, sharp and deliberate, reserved for the two people who would one day find out just how far they'd pushed me. The trust paperwork was finalized, the safe at home held a will they would never benefit from, and the instructions for that single, devastating card were sealed and waiting. I told no one directly, not even the people I trusted most, but I knew there would come a time when the idea needed to drift into their world. Not to give them certainty, but to plant a seed of doubt that would grow quietly in the back of their minds until the day it bloomed into panic. That opportunity came one afternoon while I was having coffee with an old friend named Samuel, a man I'd known since my early days in construction. He asked about my health, about the business I'd sold, and then casually about whether Melissa and Greg were all set for the future. I could have brushed it off, but instead I leaned back in my chair, looked out the window for a moment, and said, "Let's just say my estate is being handled differently now. Priorities change when you get older." I left it at that. No details, no hints about the trust or the specifics. Samuel nodded slowly, clearly curious, but he didn't press. I knew him well enough to be certain that the remark would make its way back to the right ears within a week. Word of mouth can be more precise than any letter, especially when it's carried by someone who doesn't realize he's delivering a message. Sure enough, 5 days later, my phone rang in the evening and Melissa's name flashed on the screen. I answered, keeping my tone even. "Hi, sweetheart," I said, though the word felt heavier than it used to. She started with small talk, asked how I'd been feeling lately, if I'd been keeping up with doctor's appointments, if I needed anything around the house. Her voice was warm on the surface, but I could hear the tremor underneath, the faint hitch between her words that told me this wasn't just a check-in. I let her go on for a few minutes, answering politely, before she finally eased toward the real reason for the call. "You know, Dad," she said carefully, "I was just thinking, have you, kept you all up to date? I mean, things change over time, and it's always smart to review those things, right?" There it was, wrapped in casual advice, but dripping with curiosity. I almost smiled, not because it amused me, but because it confirmed exactly what I'd intended. She had heard something, maybe not the exact truth, but enough to unsettle her. And now she was fishing. I kept my tone neutral. "I review it when I need to," I said. "Why do you ask?" She gave a little laugh. Too quick, too forced. "Oh, no reason really. I just, I want to make sure everything's in order. You've worked so hard for everything, and it's important to protect that." I could picture her sitting at her kitchen table, twisting the phone cord or tapping her nails on the counter, trying to sound nonchalant while her mind ran through every possibility. I let a pause stretch just long enough to make her shift in her seat before replying, "Everything is exactly where it needs to be." She hesitated, as if deciding whether to push, then said, "Okay, well, I'm glad to hear that." We talked for a few more minutes about nothing in particular before she ended the call. But I knew it wouldn't end there. Not for her and not for Greg. By now, she would have told him about the conversation, and the two of them would be turning it over in their heads, wondering what handled differently could mean. They'd remember the offhand comment I'd made about priorities changing. They'd wonder if their names had been replaced, if the house they joked about inheriting had slipped from their grasp. And they would have no way of knowing for sure. That uncertainty was the point. In the weeks that followed, I noticed small changes. Melissa called more often, sometimes dropping by with groceries I hadn't asked for or offering to take me to lunch. Greg, who had barely looked at me during family gatherings before, suddenly made an effort to shake my hand and ask about my week. Their smiles were just a little too polished, their gestures a little too rehearsed, as if they were trying to earn something they feared they might have already lost. I accepted their invitations when it suited me, declined when it didn't, always keeping my manner cordial, but never quite warm. I wanted them guessing, unsure whether they were winning back ground or just walking in circles. Once, at a Sunday barbecue, I caught Greg studying me from across the yard, his expression thoughtful in a way I hadn't seen before. When our eyes met, he looked away quickly, but I knew he was calculating, trying to decide whether the man in front of him was the same man they had laughed at over cake and brochures, or someone entirely different now, someone who held their future in his hands. The day came 2 years later, the air outside gray and heavy, the kind of weather that seemed to wrap itself around the mood of the people walking into the lawyer's office. I wasn't there, of course. By then I'd been gone for a week, my funeral already over, the flowers starting to wilt at the cemetery where they placed me beside my late wife. But my presence filled that room in a way they didn't expect, carried in by the sealed envelope Mr. Carver had kept in his safe since the day I signed the papers. Melissa and Greg sat together at the long table, dressed in black, their postures stiff with anticipation. They had smiled politely at the receptionist on the way in, pretending grief for anyone who might be watching. But underneath, they were certain this was the day they'd step into the future they'd always assumed was theirs. The lawyer shuffled the documents, adjusted his glasses, and began reading the formal language that had been drafted with surgical precision. At first, there was nothing unusual, boilerplate lines about the estate, the executor, the legal requirements. But as soon as he reached the section on beneficiaries, the shift began. To my daughter, Melissa Bennett, and her husband, Gregory Bennett, he read, I leave the framed memento enclosed herewith. There was a pause as he reached beneath the table and lifted a large, flat package wrapped in brown paper. He set it in front of them. Melissa frowned, glancing at Greg, then tore away the paper. Inside the frame, beneath the glass, was the very nursing home brochure they had given me as a birthday gift 2 years before. Across the front, in bold red letters stamped diagonally, was one word, denied. Gasps rippled through the room. Melissa's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Greg leaned back in his chair, his face paling, his fingers tightening on the edge of the table as if gripping it could anchor him. Mr. Carver's voice didn't falter. All remaining assets, properties, and accounts are hereby transferred to the Harold Bennett Foundation, a charitable trust established to provide educational opportunities for the children of widowed single mothers. He turned the page and continued. It was my wish that my life's work serve those who understand the value of support, kindness, and respect, and who will not take it for granted. Melissa's breathing quickened. There must be some mistake, she said, her voice cracking, but Mr. Carver didn't look at her. Instead, he read the final paragraph, the one I had written myself in careful, deliberate handwriting before he typed it into the official document. To those who once stood to inherit from me, I was your father. You treated me like a burden. Consider this my last construction project, building a life without you in it. The silence that followed was almost physical, pressing down on everyone in the room. Melissa's hands trembled as she stared at the framed brochure, her eyes darting over the smiling stock photo faces that now looked grotesque in this setting. Greg's jaw tightened, his gaze fixed on the table, unwilling to meet the eyes of anyone else in the room. The other attendees, distant relatives and legal witnesses, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, caught between pity and disbelief. Mr. Carver cleared his throat and slid a smaller envelope across the table toward Melissa. This was to be delivered to you the day after the funeral, he said. She hesitated before opening it, pulling out a single card. On it, in crisp black ink, was the sentence I had dictated to Mr. Carver that day in his office. Your inheritance was given to someone who needed it. No signature. None was necessary. Melissa's face crumpled, a flush creeping up her neck as the weight of the message sank in. Greg muttered something under his breath, too low for anyone else to hear. But his expression told the story, a mix of anger, humiliation, and the dawning realization that the future he had counted on had evaporated in an instant. Mr. Carver moved on to the formal closing of the reading, but neither of them heard a word. They were still staring at the brochure, at the red letters cutting across it like a scar, at the truth of what they had done and what it had cost them. Outside the office, life went on as it always does. Cars passed on the street. People walked by with coffee cups in hand, unaware that in a quiet room behind a pane of glass, a family bond had been severed in the most final of ways. The Harold Bennett Foundation began its work within months, awarding its first scholarships to 3 children whose mothers had lost their spouses and were struggling to keep food on the table. I wasn't there to see it, but I knew when I signed those papers that this outcome would matter more than anything I could have left to Melissa and Greg. My legacy would live where it was valued, not where it was assumed. For Melissa and Greg, the reckoning wasn't in the loss of money or property. It was in the unshakable knowledge that they had been measured, found lacking, and written out, not in anger, but in clarity. They had laughed at me on my 65th birthday, erased me from their walls, and planned my removal from my own life. And in the end, I had simply given them what they had already acted as though they'd wanted, a life without me in at the end. If you stayed with me through this entire story, you know it wasn't just about a will or money. It was about dignity, self-respect, and the moment a man decides he will no longer let others define his worth. I'd like to hear your thoughts. Did the choices I made feel justified to you? Was there a moment in this story when you would have acted differently? Tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from, because I'm curious how people in different places might see this. And if you want to hear more stories told from my own perspective, the way I lived them and the lessons they left behind, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Every voice in this community matters, and I want to know yours.